Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Micah. This is Micah's Intellectual Corner. Today we're actually going to be doing a quest video. I believe we're going to be doing the World War II animated Western Front 1940 requested by a Kawa. Thank you. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for requesting. Thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. With that being said, remember, if you guys want anything to react to, let me know. I'll react to it. I'll put it down in my video queue. I'll react to it. And I promise you, you'll get what you want. Because remember, at the end of the day, this channel is for you guys, not me. With that being said, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let's roll.
In 1939, Germany found itself in a war with Britain and France. At that time, the strength of the sides was similar, but the Allies had a significant long-term advantage and in the following years could field a much stronger army. Germany's only chance for victory was to defeat the Allies as soon as possible. It set out for an all-out attack. This video is sponsored by War Thunder. More on that later. For the Western campaign, the Germans had less than 3 million men in 135 divisions. France had 2,200,000 men in 104 divisions. They were supported by the British Expeditionary Force with the size of 500,000 men. This made...
Okay, so first of all, so here we can go ahead and see that it's the end of the phony war and start of the real deal that we've been waiting for, essentially. And we can also see how really understanding a lack of how devastating this war is really about to be, especially if it breaks out with only sending, 500,000 men, while France sent 2 million, or, got up 2 million, you know what I'm saying? So, that being said, let's roll.
German forces roughly equal. France had prepared to defend its borders. Its southern flank was covered by the Rhine River and the Vosges Hills and needed few additional defenses. Further north, the Franco-German border didn't have the benefit of natural obstacles. Here, the French had built the strongest defenses on the Maginot Line, which was held by significant forces. The mobile divisions of the French army and the British forces were on the Franco-Belgian border. They could be used to hold the northern part of the French border.
It's important to note here too, because a lot of people don't really understand why the French didn't bother to extend the Maginot Line all the way to the Channel. But it's important to note that they wanted to, but at the time it would have cost, I think, 1.6% of their actual budget, which was, a lot of money at the time. And, between, I think, 1930 and 1936. And then on top of that, Belgium started getting more hostile to the thought of it, because they were trying to return to a position of neutrality, and they thought that would be kind of, Anyway, let's roll.
Or to reinforce the Maginot Line or the Belgian army if Germany was to invade. The French had more tanks than the Germans, but they had dispersed many of them among their infantry and could only field 3 tank and 3 light mechanized divisions. The Germans had deployed their tanks in single units and had 10 tank divisions at hand. The Germans wanted to use this as the core element of their plan. At first, they would invade the Low Countries. This would have the Allies to commit their forces to Belgium, so they were not able to counter the real German attack in the south. The main German tank force would move through the Ardennes region and break through at the weakest part of the French defenses, then extend the offensive towards the coast and cut off the Allied forces. In order to move into the Low Countries, Germany would have to...
Remember, he's trying to have 50 Vermont divisions smacked through that? That's a lot of men. That's a lot of freaking men he's about to smack through there.
Through their defensive lines. Germany exploited the fact that these nations were not at war and had therefore not fully manned their defenses. They were able to launch an airborne assault and capture a section of both Dutch and Belgian lines. Now the paratroopers had to hold out until they would be reinforced by the land forces. Learning of the German invasion, the Allies now had to decide how to intervene in Belgium. They could move part of their forces into Western Belgium, or they could deploy most of them in...
I feel like Belgium really is a victim, mainly Belgium, is really a victim of, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it, because, I mean, come on, 21, 25 years ago, and we're back at it again. That's crazy.
Central part of the country. They wanted to give Belgium maximum assistance and went for the latter.
Whoa.
They also sent part of the troops to help the Netherlands, fully deploying their forces. In Belgium, the Germans were able to link up with their airborne troops. With Belgian defenses breached, the Belgian army began pulling back to central Belgium. In the north, the Germans advanced into the gap between the Belgian and the Dutch defenses and linked up with the paratroopers holding part of the Dutch line. This allowed them to move part of the tank forces behind the Dutch main line. When the Germans threatened to launch a terror bombing campaign against the Dutch cities, the Netherlands surrendered. At the same time, the tank divisions further south had overrun Luxembourg and pushed aside the Allied screening units. Soon they reached the prepared French defensive lines. The Germans launched a massive aerial bombardment. The French second-rate divisions could not withstand the attack by the best German units, and the Germans were able to breach the defenses. The French thought...
And remember too, at this point, I think I said this in my last video for the oversimplified reaction, but at this point they also had the massive, I want to say Gustav cannon, the rail cannon right here. This was also made for it, but it wasn't ready in time. I think it was out of production by like a few months, if not like at least like a year or two. But it was made for the Maginot Line. It was made for those huge, thick bunkers at the time. Because at the time, those were the strongest defensive line, period. You know what I'm saying? So it was ready for it, and that's how big this was. So, you know, again, it wasn't ready, and they ended up using it out east when, you know, for Operation Barbarossa. But let's roll.
The French thought that the Germans wanted to outflank the main body of the Maginot Line by moving south and concentrated on that direction. Seeing that the French western flank was barely covered, the German tank commanders took a risk and moved forward without waiting for their infantry. The Allies were surprised by the German breakthrough, but they now knew that this was the main German attack. They began redeploying their reserves to that area. At the same time, they ordered the troops in Belgium to fall back in order to put them into a better position and free up some divisions. The Allies did not know whether the Germans were moving towards Paris or the Channel coast and had to cover both directions. For that, they could use the 3 tank divisions located in the area. But the question was, where should they make the stand?
Real quick too, here we see the Germans starting to use the Blitzkrieg. Now, for you guys who don't know this, this is how it works. So they would identify a weak spot in the enemy line. They would deploy a whole bunch of smoke screen to, you know, hide the amassing army coming up there, and then pretty much, and they would begin an aerial bombardment to soften up the troops down there. And after that, that's when the tank divisions would break through the line, followed by the mechanized divisions to help clean up and encircle whatever division that they're trying to encircle. And from there, the infantry comes in and cleans up the rest. And that's pretty much how the Blitzkrieg worked. And obviously they would use, you know, throwing different refugees at here. I think that's what they did in this, actually. They threw a whole bunch of refugees at them so it would slow them down, and think in Belgium, while they Blitzkrieg through the Ardennes. But yeah,
will wait for their infantry to consolidate and therefore won't be moving very fast. As a result, they believed that they had the time to prepare defensive positions on the Oise River. The German command had indeed ordered their tanks to slow down, but the German tank commanders had ignored the orders and continued to advance. They moved much faster than the French had expected, and the Germans encountered the French units as they were still assembling. This caught the 1st French Armored Division off guard, and it was destroyed, while the 2nd Division was dispersed and overrun. The 4th Tank Division was not on the main axis of the German advance and was able to cover the assembly of the French troops on the Paris direction. The German tanks now needed for their infantry and supplies to catch up. As a result, the advance of the German tanks slowed down, and in the following days they were able to take only limited territory. The Allies were in the process of finishing the withdrawal in Belgium, and they were able to deploy troops to cover the Paris direction. But they hadn't had the time to put their troops between the Germans and the Channel. They decided that their best hope was to attack the German spearhead from 2 sides and encircle it. However, their light mechanized divisions were still pinned down on the front, and with 2 of their tank divisions destroyed, they lacked the sufficient strength. As a result, the Allies were only able to undertake limited counterattacks. First one was by the 4th Tank Division, but it didn't have much effect. Meanwhile, the Germans had consolidated their lines and finished the resupply. They resumed the offensive in full strength, and with little Allied troops to cover the general direction, they soon reached the sea. The Allies launched an attack at Arras, but it was only of limited success. The Germans turned north with the intention of capturing the...
Remember too, I think it's a good thing to remember, it's not just, at this point, it's not just, French, British, Belgium, and Dutch forces, not just them for the Allies. You also got to remember, because at this time, France and the UK are still empires, so you also have Moroccan forces, Canadian forces, and Polish exile forces too that are helping in this fight for the Allies, which is pretty cool when you think about it. But I think it's a point in that's not really talked about a lot in history, but
the Channel ports and cutting the Allies off from their supply lines. This move threatened the Allied units with outflanking, and they had to send many of the units they had carried for the counterattack to extend the flanks north. As a result, their northern force was unable to launch the counterattack. At the same time, their forces in the south held their positions to have a chance to link up with the possible counterattack from the main French lines. The Germans ordered their units in the west of the pocket on defensive to meet the possible Allied breakout attempt. The French were deploying forces for an attack from the south, but as more of German infantry arrived to the sector, they needed more troops. But with the troops in the north without access to supply and being threatened with encirclement, it was impossible to wait any longer. Therefore, it was decided to evacuate the troops. They could attempt to break out or be pulled out by sea. As the Allies had become too weak to attempt a breakout, it was decided to pull their troops out of the ports still under their control. The Allies began the retreat to the sea. The Germans attempted to break their lines and cut off part of their forces. As the Allied forces were leaving, the Belgian army was unable to resist the Germans on its own and surrendered. The Germans were able to cut off...
Yeah, this is why I love this stuff. I love military history, all that stuff, and being in the military, it's just fascinating to see different things like this and different tactics you really come into play and actually pretty much work. But it's really is fascinating, and it really gets me into doing this. But as you can see, we're about to get into the Dunkirk evacuation of the British, and as you can see, currently a lot of French men are actually sacrificing their lives right now for that evacuation.
Part of the French forces. Other troops managed to hold a solid front, reach the sea, and proceeded with the evacuation. The Germans pulled most of their forces back and started to prepare for their second attack on France. More than 300,000 Allied soldiers were able to be evacuated, but all of their equipment was lost. As the Allies weren't able to replace it in time, most of these soldiers didn't take part in the next phase of the Battle of France. Now the Germans outnumbered the French. The French were holding the positions on the Somme and Eure rivers. However, the Germans had established several bridgeheads which weakened the defense. To overcome that, the French could pull the main forces back to the next river line around Paris, but they decided against it. The French wanted to use the defensive advantage provided by the rivers in northern France to inflict significant casualties on the...
I think it's also good to remember too that although a little bit over 300,000 soldiers were evacuated, somewhere between 1,000 and 3,500 British soldiers were also still killed at this time, and over 16,000 French soldiers gave their lives for that evacuation, like I said. So yeah, it's just a shitty situation all over. But
in the hope that it would run out of steam. In order to do that, the French needed to avoid the breakthrough by the German tanks at all costs. The Germans did not want to give France any time to recover, and as soon as part of their forces got ready, they attacked. At first, the French plan worked, and they were able to fall back in an organized manner, but soon the first breakthrough happened. The German tanks broke through the French lines and reached the river Seine. The French were able to destroy the breaches and block their advance. But the German tanks now moved towards the sea and cut off part of the Allied forces. By then, the other part of the German forces had joined the attack. The French were able to slowly pull back, but eventually the German tanks were able to break through. The French troops west of Paris had been encircled and destroyed, and as a result the Germans were able to cross the Seine unopposed, and the French lacked the troops to contain them. The French command was afraid that now their troops were going to be encircled, and ordered them to break contact with the Germans and move further south to make a stand on the Loire River.
Yeah, see, if you can tell, their Germans' war plan is pretty much essential with those tanks. Like, that is like the most essential part, if you ask me, for the Blitzkrieg, because, you know, for the most part, because that is literally what is punching through every single time, you know what I'm saying? So that is kind of pretty to see, although, you know, I don't condone Germany at this time. It's still really pretty to see.
On the Loire River. The defense of Paris was abandoned, but the withdrawal broke the cohesion of the French armies, and the German tanks were able to fully break through into the French rear. Germany wanted not to allow the French forces to escape and attempted to cut off and destroy as much of them as possible. With most of the French army moving on foot, the tanks could easily outmaneuver them. They pushed deep into the French rear, and many of the French units were caught or bypassed and dispersed. With most of the French army in the west in retreat, the largest portion of intact French forces were behind the Maginot Line. They had pulled a lot of the forces off from line into field divisions, which could pose a threat to Germans. The Germans set out to destroy them. They attempted to overwhelm the French defenders by attack from all directions. Their main force would move in from the west, while the tanks outflanked the line from the south. At the same time, they launched attacks through the weakened line from north and east. Meanwhile, the French had reached the Loire River in force and attempted to make a stand. However, they were unable to cover all the crossings, and on the same day, the pursuing German forces crossed the river. The French continued the retreat. At the same time, the German tanks overran the French forces retreating in the north. The French in the east were unable to form a solid front against the German offensive from several directions, and the Germans were able to encircle them and push them into a small pocket, making them surrender. Only a small part of the French forces was able to survive the retreat, and the odds had become too unfavorable to continue the war. Although the French were successfully resisting attempts by Italy to cross the Alps, they were unable to resist Germany. They agreed to German terms and signed the armistice, which would come into effect 2 days later. There were several reasons why France lost the campaign, but lacking good tanks was not one of them.
Alright guys, we're going to go ahead and end it right there. So as we see at the end of that, France became Vichy France, and which was just a puppet state pretty much of the Nazis. Very, very compelling stuff. With that being said, please join me again. Next video is going to be another suggestion video. I promise you guys, if you guys leave a comment of a suggested video, I will get back to you and I will bring it into my video queue. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. With that being said, we out.